She had exactly 4 minutes before her father came back through that door. 4 minutes to decide whether she would spend the rest of her life flinching every time a man raised his voice, or whether she would walk out of this bakery and never look back. The stranger standing in her kitchen was nobody. A drifter. A man with mud on his boots and dust in his collar who had no business making her an offer like that. But he had looked at her bruises and hadn't looked away. Nobody in Red Hollow had ever done that before. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see just how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The bread always burned a little on Tuesdays. Evelyn Mercer had learned that years ago, something about the way the afternoon sun came through the west-facing window and heated the left side of the oven unevenly. She had mentioned it to her father once, back when she was 15 and still naive enough to believe that practical information was the same thing as useful conversation. Harold had told her to pay better attention. Then he knocked the bread pan off the counter, and she spent the next hour cleaning flour off the floorboards while he drank on the porch. She never mentioned the oven again. Now, at 23, Evelyn simply rotated the pans every 12 minutes, worked around the problem the same way she worked around every problem in her life. Quietly, carefully, without ever letting anyone see that she was doing it. She had become expert at invisibility, at shrinking, at making herself into something small enough to fit inside the narrow space Harold allowed her to occupy. The bakery sat at the south end of Red Hollow's main street, wedged between a saddle shop on one side and a dry goods store on the other. Red Hollow was not a pretty town. It had been built fast and cheap by silver money, the kind of town that went up in 3 years and could come down just as quick once the ore ran thin. The buildings were mostly raw lumber gone gray in the desert sun. The streets were dirt that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The people who stayed were the ones who couldn't afford to leave, and that particular combination, trapped people with hard lives, had given the town a permanent mean streak that ran just below the surface of every interaction. Evelyn had lived here her entire life. She pulled the morning's last batch from the oven and set the loaves on the cooling rack near the front window. Outside, the main street was doing its usual midday shuffle, miners heading to the saloon, merchants arguing over a delivery at the far corner, a couple of ranch horses tied up in front of the land office. Dust moved through the air in slow curtains. The heat was already brutal, and it wasn't yet noon. She pressed the back of her wrist against her forehead, pushing a damp strand of dark hair away from her face. Her arms ached from the early morning kneading. They always ached. Her back ached too, from sleeping on the narrow cot in the back room. She had given up her actual bedroom when Harold had needed the space to store grain sacks, and she had not argued about it, because arguing cost more than sleeping on a cot. The bell above the front door jangled. "Good morning, Mr. Tillman," she said without turning around, because she recognized the particular slow weight of the man's footsteps. "Morning, Evelyn." The old assayer came in, same as every Tuesday, for 2 loaves of sourdough. He set his coins on the counter. He never made eye contact with her. Most people in Red Hollow didn't, not really. They looked at the bread, at the shelves, at the floor, any place that wasn't her face, because looking at Evelyn Mercer's face too long meant noticing things that were uncomfortable to notice. The yellow-green shadow along her left jaw had faded almost completely, but almost was not entirely, and old Tillman was good at almost. "Harold around?" he asked. "Not yet. He'll be back this afternoon." Tillman nodded, took his loaves, and left without another word. The bell jangled again. The street outside swallowed him. Evelyn picked up the coins and put them in the tin box beneath the counter. She pressed 2 fingers against her jaw, lightly, testing. Still tender along the bone. That part always took the longest. Whoa. She had tried to leave twice before. The first time she was 18. She'd packed a canvas bag with a change of clothes, her mother's silver brooch, and about $11 she'd saved over the course of a year, hiding coins in the hollow of a broken brick behind the oven. She'd planned to take the stage to Elko and find work there, laundry, cleaning, something. Harold had found the bag before she reached the end of the block. She didn't try to leave again for nearly 3 years. The second attempt was quieter, more careful. She'd made contact with a woman named Mrs. Hobart who ran a boarding house in a town called Grantville, about 60 miles east. She'd sent 3 letters. Mrs. Hobart had written back, said there was a room, said she could start earning her keep with kitchen work. Evelyn had gotten as far as saddling the old mare behind the bakery before Harold appeared in the stable doorway with a lantern. She still couldn't fully close her right hand in cold weather, so she had stopped trying. Not because she had accepted her life, she had not accepted it, not for a single day, but because hope was a dangerous thing in Red Hollow, and she had learned to be careful with it. She kept what was left of it somewhere deep and private, the way you'd keep a single match in a storm, sheltered in your fist, not yet struck. She had simply stopped believing that her particular match would ever find dry wood. The afternoon came in hard and bright, the way Nevada afternoons did in late summer, like the sky had a grudge against anything that moved too slowly. Evelyn had just finished wiping down the front display case when she heard the familiar scrape of Harold's boots on the back step. She straightened, reset her face into something neutral. Harold Mercer pushed through the back door carrying nothing but the smell of whiskey and whatever bad mood had followed him from wherever he'd been. He was a big man, not tall, exactly, but wide, with hands that were too large for the rest of him, and a face that seemed permanently arranged into suspicion. He'd been a decent-looking man once, people said. Evelyn had no memory of that version of him. He looked at the cooling rack, at the tin box, at her. "Tillman come in?" he said. "Yes, sir. Took his usual 2 loaves. Anyone else?" "A few." It was a decent morning. Harold grunted and pulled the tin box out from under the counter without asking. He counted the coins with his thick fingers, moving them from one palm to the other. Evelyn stood still. She had learned long ago not to move much when he was counting money, because any kind of motion seemed to irritate him during that particular activity. "Should be more," he said. "It's a Tuesday." "I know what day it is, girl." "Yes, sir." He put the coins in his vest pocket, all of them, not the half share she was supposed to keep for restocking flour, and went back into the kitchen. She heard him moving things around, the familiar sound of him looking for the other bottle she'd hidden because the one he'd already found was empty. She had hidden it behind the flour sacks again. He found it in about 3 minutes. He always found it. She heard him settle into the kitchen chair with the creak of someone who intended to stay put for a while, and she felt the particular tension in her chest start to loosen very slightly. When he was settled and drinking, that was manageable. It was when he was moving around that things got unpredictable. She turned back to the front window and looked at the street. The afternoon light was hitting the mountains to the east, turning them a deep amber color. Somewhere past those mountains, past the salt flats and the desert, and the whole long brutal stretch of Nevada, there was a world she had never seen. People who didn't know her name. Towns where nobody would look at the side of her jaw and find something not to notice. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of wanting it. Then she turned away. She was reorganizing the bread shelf when the back door opened. She assumed it was Harold going out again, which happened sometimes, so she didn't look up immediately. She just kept stacking the remaining loaves in the order they needed to be sold. Oldest in front, freshest in back, the same way she'd been doing it since she was old enough to reach the shelf. "He's out front." She spun around. A man was standing in the kitchen doorway. Not Harold. Someone she'd never seen before, tall, lean, with dust-brown trail clothes and a hat pushed back far enough to show most of his face. Maybe 30, maybe a little older, with dark eyes that were doing something she wasn't used to, looking directly at her, steady and serious, not sliding away. She took a step back. Her hand went to the counter. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice came out quieter than she wanted. "Name's Caleb Ryder." He didn't move from the doorway. Kept his hands visible, which she noticed. "I came in through the alley. I saw your father working himself up on the front step. I didn't want to go around to the front." "You shouldn't be back here." "No, ma'am, I shouldn't." He said it plainly, like he was agreeing with her and not planning to do anything about it. "I'm sorry for scaring you." She stared at him. He was being careful with her, she realized, standing still, not blocking the door to the back room. She wasn't sure she'd ever had a man be careful with her before, and it confused her enough that she forgot to tell him to leave again. "What do you want?" she asked. He paused, like he was deciding something. "I rode in from the north this morning," he said. "I was at the land office for most of the morning. I was sitting by the window and I could see the front of this building." He stopped. "I saw what happened when you opened the door for that delivery. Earlier." Evelyn's jaw tightened. She said nothing. "The flour delivery," he said. "The fellow was late. Your father came outside." "That's our business," she said. Yes, ma'am. He didn't argue with her, just looked at her with that steady, uncomfortable directness. I'm not saying it isn't. She could hear Harold now moving around on the porch, talking to someone. It sounded like he'd found the neighbor's hired hand, which meant he'd want an audience for whatever mood he was in. That was both better and worse. Better because it occupied him. Worse because public moods could tip fast. What are you doing in Red Hollow? She asked. It came out more like an interrogation than she'd meant it to. Passing through, he said. I've been moving west for about 3 months. I pick up work where I can find it. Cattle drives, fence work, whatever needs doing. He paused again. I stopped here because I heard there might be work at one of the ranches south of town. There isn't. That's what they told me at the saloon. She looked at him more carefully. He didn't look like the kind of man who showed up at a woman's back door to cause trouble. Not that there was a reliable way to tell. She knew that. But there was something in the way he held himself that was different from the men she was used to. No swagger, no performance. He seemed like someone who was used to being alone. Then why are you still here? She asked. I was going to leave this morning, he said. And then I didn't. Before she could answer, Harold's voice hit the front door like a thrown stone. He was done with the neighbor's hand. She could hear him coming back inside. Caleb heard it too. He glanced toward the sound, then back at her. Is there someone you can go to? He asked. His voice had dropped. Family, somewhere. Anyone? She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale instead. No, she said. Harold's boots hit the floor in the front room. She heard the counter being slapped, his way of summoning her. Evelyn. Her body moved toward the sound before she made a decision about it. Years of conditioning. She was halfway to the doorway before she stopped herself, which she didn't usually do, and turned back. Caleb was still standing there, watching her. Evelyn, louder this time. Coming, she called. Then lower to the stranger. You need to leave. I know, he said. He still didn't move. Listen, I know this is nothing. I know I'm nobody. But if you ever want to leave this place... He stopped, seemed to reconsider, tried again. I mean what I'm saying. She stared at him. Evelyn. The third call had an edge to it she recognized. Not anger yet. The warning note before anger. I'm coming, Papa. She looked at Caleb one more time. The back gate latch sticks, she said quietly. You have to lift and push at the same time. She didn't know why she told him that. She turned and went through the doorway. But Harold's mood that evening was the kind that moved like weather, shifting without warning, settling into calm long enough to make you believe it, then turning fast. He ate the dinner she made without complaining, which was something. He drank without getting into the particular rhythm that meant bad things were coming, at least for the first hour. Evelyn moved through the kitchen and the front room with the careful economy of motion she'd perfected over years. 2 steps to the left of his usual path. Don't let the kettle whistle too long. Don't put the bowls down too hard. Don't be too quiet, because too quiet made him suspicious. But don't be too present either, because too present reminded him she was there. She had spent her entire adult life navigating a man's moods the way you navigated bad terrain, always looking 1 step ahead, always knowing where the solid ground was. It wore on a person. She could feel it some nights as a kind of physical weight, pressing on the back of her neck, sitting on her chest. After he went to bed, she washed the dishes in the dark. She didn't light the lamp because the lamplight sometimes woke him, and she wanted the kitchen to herself for just a little while. She stood at the basin and thought about the stranger with the steady eyes who had asked her a question nobody had ever asked before. Is there someone you can go to? Like it was a reasonable thing to wonder, like the answer might matter. She scrubbed the iron pot until her arms ached. I was there the next morning. Not in the bakery. Not obviously. But she spotted him when she went to open the shutters on the front window. He was sitting on the bench outside the land office across the street, hat tipped down, doing nothing in particular with a level of commitment that told her he'd been there a while. She stood at the window for a moment. He didn't look up. She went back to her bread. An hour later, when she stepped out to shake the flour cloth, he crossed the street. He didn't come toward the front. He angled around toward the alley. She followed the motion out of the corner of her eye. A few minutes later, she heard the back gate, lifted and pushed at the same time. She met him in the kitchen doorway. You don't give up, she said. I've been called stubborn. He wasn't smiling. Is he here? Not until afternoon. He nodded. He had something in his hand. a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She took it without thinking, then unfolded it. It was a deed. She looked at it, read it again, looked up at him. Where did you get this? Land office. Yesterday, before they closed. He leaned against the doorframe. I was going through the Nevada Territory land filings because I needed something to do, and the clerk doesn't care who reads them. There's a parcel in Black Creek Valley, about 40 miles southeast of here. Creek fed. 230 acres. The deed's been sitting in probate for 2 years, he paused. The registered owner was a man named Thomas Dunn. She went very still. My grandfather, she said. I know. He nodded at the paper. He left it to you, put it in his will, and registered it with the territorial office before he died. It never transferred because your father never filed the inheritance paperwork. The land office clerk said the property's just sitting there. He met her eyes. It's yours, Evelyn. Legally yours. Your father can't touch it. She looked down at the deed again. Her grandfather's handwriting in the line marked beneficiary. Her name. Her full name, Evelyn May Mercer, in the clerk's neat official script. Her hands were shaking. She realized she was pressing the paper hard enough to crinkle the edges and made herself loosen her grip. Why are you doing this? She asked. He took a moment before answering. She got the sense he was being honest rather than careful, which were different things. Because I walked into this town and I saw something that shouldn't be happening, he said, and I could walk away from it, which is what most people do. Or I could not. He shrugged, a small, almost uncomfortable movement. I chose not. You don't know me. No, ma'am. That land is 40 miles away. It's probably falling apart. Probably. And what's your part in this? You help me get to the property, and then what? You ride on? He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking on that, he said carefully. Your father's going to come after you the minute he figures out you're gone. A woman alone on an unclaimed property with no livestock, no equipment, and no neighbors isn't in a good position. He seemed uncomfortable saying the next part. I need work. I need land. I've been riding 3 months and I don't have either. The property could use a hand who knows ranch work, and you'd have... He stopped. You'd have someone around. She stared at him. You're talking about staying on my grandfather's land. Only if you wanted that. We don't know each other. That's true. You're describing a marriage, she said flatly, to a stranger. Yes, ma'am. I suppose I am. He met her eyes steadily. I know how that sounds. I know it's a strange thing to say to someone you just met. But I've been turning it over since yesterday, and I can't find a better solution, and I figured you deserved to have the choice laid out plain instead of me dressing it up in something it's not. She sat down on the kitchen stool because her legs had gone unreliable. You're serious, she said. I am. You'd marry a woman you just met and go build a ranch on 40 miles of desert property. It's creek-fed land. That's the difference between desert and working ranch. She almost laughed again. It almost came out this time. She looked down at the deed in her hands, at her grandfather's name, at her own. Outside, in the distance, she could hear the stage coming down the main street. The regular afternoon stage from the north. She had watched that stage come in her whole life from this window and never once been on it. My father will come after us, she said. I know. He's not going to accept it. He'll ride out there and he'll... She stopped. I know, Caleb said again, quieter this time. She looked at him. He held the look without flinching. He had the face of someone who understood hard things and hadn't decided to pretend otherwise, which was more than she could say for most people she'd encountered. You'd have to mean it, she said. If you said you'd keep him away, you'd have to actually mean it. I mean it. She folded the deed again, creased it carefully, put it in her apron pocket. He'll be back by 3 o'clock, she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. I need to pack some things. She was not romantic about it. That was important to understand. She didn't pack like a woman who believed she was running toward something wonderful. She packed like someone who had learned at considerable cost not to let herself believe in things until they proved themselves real. She took the practical things. 2 dresses. Her winter coat, even though it was August. The money she'd managed to save again over the past 2 years, $15 and some coins, hidden in a different spot than before, inside the stuffing of the kitchen chair cushion. Her mother's silver brooch, a small knife she'd started keeping in her boot after the second time she'd tried to leave. She did not take anything that belonged to Harold. Not even anything he'd bought for the bakery with money she had earned because she wanted to be clean of it. She wanted to walk out of this building carrying only what was actually hers. She left bread on the cooling rack for whatever customer came in tomorrow. She'd done that, set out bread for customers she would never serve. And then she stood in the front room for a moment and looked at it. The cracked shelves, the uneven floor. The window with the busted latch she'd fixed 4 times with wire because Harold would never pay for a carpenter. She had been so small in this room, for so long. She walked out the back door. What? Caleb was waiting at the alley with 2 horses. His own chestnut trail horse and an older gray mare he'd bought that morning, he told her, from a man at the edge of town. That's the Hanson mare, she said. He sold her cheap. She's sound. She's 16 years old. She'll get you 40 miles. He was tying her bag to the mare's saddle. He looked at her. You ready? No, she said honestly. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. We should move. They went south through the alleys, keeping off the main street. She felt exposed the entire time, the way she'd felt as a child playing too close to the edge of something high. Her heart was doing something loud and unsteady in her chest. She kept waiting to hear Harold's voice behind her. They made it out of Red Hollow's south end and hit the open trail without incident. She didn't look back. She had decided she wouldn't, and she didn't. The Nevada desert opened up in front of them, vast and indifferent and sun-hammered, and she rode out into it beside a stranger with mud on his boots and a deed in her pocket, and absolutely no certainty about anything at all, except one. She was not going back. Not for anything. They rode hard for the first 2 hours, putting distance between themselves and Red Hollow while the afternoon light turned long and orange across the scrubland. Caleb set a pace that was fast enough to cover ground but careful enough not to blow the horses, and she matched it without complaint. Her riding was rusty. She hadn't been on a horse in over a year, Harold having sold the stable mare for cash. But it came back to her the way things you learned young always do. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say yet, and she appreciated that he seemed to understand that. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with reassurance. He just rode. About an hour before dark, he stopped at a dry wash that had a little water pooled in the low end. He watered the horses while she climbed stiffly off the gray mare and stretched her back. The mountains to the east were turning purple. The sky above them was going to a deep, clear blue that she'd always thought was the best part of Nevada, if Nevada had a best part. We'll make camp here, Caleb said. Start before light, and we can reach Black Creek by midday tomorrow. She nodded. She wrapped her coat around her shoulders, even though it wasn't fully cold yet. You should eat something, he said. I'm all right. He looked at her sideways. When did you last eat? She had to think about it. Breakfast, which had been the heel of old bread she hadn't been able to sell. That was early morning. I'll eat, she said. He made a small fire, low, careful, positioned behind a rock outcropping so it wouldn't throw light onto the open plain behind them. He had dried beef and hardtack and some coffee, which she hadn't had in months because Harold thought coffee was a waste of money. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup and felt the warmth move up through her palms. How long have you been moving west? She asked. Since March. He was looking at the fire. I had a job on a cattle operation in Kansas. Didn't work out. What happened? The owner was cutting his operation down and I was one of the hands he let go. A pause. That's the whole story. She had the sense it wasn't quite the whole story, but that he was used to keeping pieces of things for himself, which was fair. She was the same way. Have you been married before? She asked. He looked at her, then back at the fire. No, neither have I. She took a sip of coffee. I don't know much about it. Me either. That's concerning, given what we're doing. He was quiet for a moment, then, very quietly, yeah. She almost smiled. It was so deadpan, so without any comfort in it, that it was somehow more honest than anything reassuring would have been. She felt some tight thing in her chest loosen, just slightly. My grandfather built that property, she said. I visited it once when I was little. He had sheep, I think, and a kitchen garden that my grandmother kept. She died before I was old enough to remember her. She turned the cup in her hands. After he died, I thought my father would go out and claim it. But he never did. I think he was afraid of the work. What was your grandfather like? She thought about it. He called me by my full name, my middle name too, Evelyn May. Nobody else did that. She paused. He seemed like he had decided to be decent and stuck to it. Caleb said nothing to that. but he was listening. They sat in silence for a while. The fire burned low. The desert settled into its nighttime sounds. The distant sigh of wind, something small moving through the scrub, the horses shifting against their tether. She was exhausted, bone-tired in a way that was both from the riding and from everything that had happened in the last 8 hours. She lay down on the hard ground with her coat as a blanket and stared at the sky, which out here away from Red Hollow's dust was full of more stars than she usually let herself look at. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. Thank you. For the deed, for—" She stopped, for not looking away. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet and matter-of-fact, like he was noting something obvious. "Nobody should have," he said. She closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she fell asleep without listening for anything. They reached Black Creek Valley the following afternoon, dusty and saddle-sore, coming over the ridge in the late gold light. She saw it before she expected to. A low valley cut by a thin creek line, cottonwood trees along the water, and in the middle of it the rough outline of buildings that had once been a working ranch. Even from the ridge she could see the disrepair, the broken fence lines, the collapsed corner of what might have been a barn, the weathered gray of untreated wood left too long to the elements. She stopped the gray mare at the top of the ridge and looked at it. It was a ruin. There was no other word for it. "It needs work," Caleb said. She almost didn't hear him. She was looking at the creek, catching light between the cottonwoods and the mountains beyond, and the long rolling land that stretched south toward nothing she knew. "It needs a lot of work," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She urged the mare forward. Down the ridge, toward the valley, toward the broken fences and the dusty, empty corrals, and the building her grandfather had built with his own hands and left with her name on it. She rode toward it like she meant to stay. She did mean to stay. Her name was Evelyn Mae Mercer. She was 23 years old. She had $15 and some coins and one dress too many and a silver brooch that had been her mother's, and she had no idea what she was doing, but she was here. She was here, and she was not in Red Hollow, and the land under her horse's feet was hers. For right now, that was everything. The first morning at Black Creek, Evelyn woke up on the floor, not because there was no bed. There was one, a heavy pine frame her grandfather had built that had survived 2 years of abandonment better than most of the rest of the place. But because the mattress had been eaten through by something, mice or worse, and she hadn't wanted to sleep on what was left of it. So she'd folded her coat into a pillow and laid out on the floorboards and slept harder than she had in years, which said something about the floor or something about Red Hollow, and she wasn't entirely sure which. She lay there for a moment in the gray early light coming through the window. No glass in that window, just open air and a piece of sacking she'd tacked up the night before, and listened to the ranch. It was not quiet the way she'd expected. The creek made noise, a low, continuous sound that moved under everything else. Birds she didn't know the names of were doing something loud in the cottonwoods. The wind off the mountains came through the open window and smelled like sage and cold water, and it was nothing like Red Hollow's dust and manure smell, nothing like it at all, and she breathed it in until her chest felt too full. She got up. She had work to do. That was the thing about having your own place, she was discovering. The work was endless, but it was different work than she'd known before. At the bakery, the work had been a kind of tax, something extracted from her for the right to exist in a space that was never actually hers. Here, every fence post. Caleb pounded back into the ground, and every bucket of water she hauled from the creek to scrub the cabin floor was building something that had her name on it. The exhaustion at the end of the day felt different, earned somehow, like something she'd chosen rather than something that had happened to her. Caleb was already outside when she stepped onto the porch. She could hear him around the side of the barn, the regular thunk of a hammer working a problem. He'd been up before her, she didn't know how long before, but his bedroll near the fireplace was already neatly rolled and the tin coffee pot was sitting on the edge of the hearth, still warm. She poured herself a cup and carried it outside. The valley looked different in morning light than it had when they'd arrived. Smaller, maybe, but more real. The creek caught the early sun between the cottonwoods and threw it around in pieces. The mountains to the west still had shadow on them. The south pasture, what she could see of it, was dry grass, but it was thick. Good grazing land if they ever got livestock to graze it. "You need to look at the well," Caleb said from around the corner of the barn. Not a greeting, just information. He appeared a moment later, wiping his hands on his trouser leg. There was already dirt on his forearms and a fresh scrape across his knuckles. The casing's cracked. We've been lucky the creek's running, but we can't count on creek water long term. Winter freeze, drought. We need the well working. Can you fix it? Not by myself. I need to know if there's a hardware supplier in the nearest town. Millard Springs. About 12 miles east. She'd known that from her grandfather's letters, the ones her mother had kept before she died. There's a general store. I don't know what they carry. I'll ride out tomorrow and see. He looked at the barn roof. The north corner of the barn is worse than I thought. 2 of the support beams have rotted through. I can sister them with green timber if I can find decent wood near the creek, but it's going to take a few days. She looked at the barn, at the pasture, at the long list of things that needed doing that she was only beginning to understand the full scope of. We need supplies, she said. Basic ones. I have $15. I have 22. He said it matter-of-factly, no performance around it. Combined, that's enough to get started if we're careful. She nodded. She wasn't used to talking about money with anyone. Harold had always treated money as his exclusive territory, something she produced and he managed. And there was something odd about it, about just saying numbers out loud to another person and having them say numbers back. We should make a list, she said. Already started one. He pulled a folded scrap from his vest pocket. She took it. His handwriting was plain and functional, the letters formed like a man who'd learned to write practically rather than ornamentally. Nails, rope, canvas, lamp oil, flour, salt. She reached into her own pocket and found the stub of pencils she'd taken from the bakery. She added coffee, matches, a new mattress tick if they had one. She thought a moment, thread and needles. She handed it back. He looked at her additions. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. Thread and needles, he said. Things tear, she said. Fair enough. They stood there for a moment in the morning light. 2 people with a list and $37 and an enormous amount of work between them and anything resembling a functioning life. It should have felt impossible. It felt instead like the start of something, rough-edged and uncertain, but real in a way that $15 hidden in a chair cushion had never quite been. I'll start on the cabin floor, she said. There are boards that need to be re-nailed before someone goes through one. He nodded, already looking back at the barn, already working out the next problem. She went inside and got the hammer. The justice of the peace in Millard Springs was a dry, efficient man named Aldridge, who married them 3 days later with the same energy he might have used to record a land transfer, which suited both of them fine. There were 2 witnesses, the store clerk and a woman who'd been waiting to mail a letter. And the whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Evelyn signed her name in the register and walked back out into the street as Mrs. Caleb Ryder, which was a strange thing to be, and she stood on the boardwalk for a moment, adjusting to the strangeness of it, while Caleb settled up for the supplies inside. She had expected to feel something dramatic. She didn't, particularly. She felt tired and a little hungry, and aware that her boot had developed a rub on her left heel. What she felt, underneath all of that, was a low, steady sense of solidity, like something had been nailed down. They rode back to Black Creek with the supplies loaded on the gray mare and didn't say much. It was becoming apparent that she and Caleb had a natural tolerance for silence that neither of them had to work at, which was more useful than it might sound. She'd lived with Harold, who used silence as a weapon and noise as another kind of weapon, and the ease of simply riding through the desert without anyone working an angle was something she was still learning to trust. That evening, she made biscuits in the newly cleaned hearth and burned the first batch because the firebox ran hotter than she expected, and the second batch came out acceptable, if not exactly good, and she and Caleb ate them with the dried beef and didn't complain. Afterward, he sat near the fire and oiled his saddle, and she mended a tear in her spare dress by lamplight, and it was unremarkable, and it was the quietest evening she'd had in as long as she could remember. "You're good at being still," she said at some point. He glanced up from the saddle. "What do you mean?" "Most men I've known needed to be doing something loud." She kept her eyes on her needlework. Talking or drinking or causing trouble, like quiet, made them nervous. He thought about that. "Quiet never bothered me much," he said finally. "Grew up with a lot of it. My father wasn't much of a talker." "Was he a decent man?" A pause. "He had his days." She understood that answer completely. She didn't push on it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was hard and unglamorous, and not at all what anyone would have called comfortable. The well repair took Caleb the better part of 2 weeks, working with materials from Millard Springs and a technique he'd learned from a well digger in Oklahoma who he'd worked alongside briefly years before. It worked, mostly. The water had a mineral taste to it that Evelyn hated but eventually stopped noticing. The barn roof took longer than the well. Everything took longer than expected. That was the central fact of frontier building, she was learning, that no job was ever just the job it appeared to be. You pulled one board and found the rot underneath. You fixed one fence line and discovered a sinkhole at the north corner. You cleaned the chimney and half the mortar came out with the soot. She kept herself busy in ways that mattered. She replanted her grandfather's kitchen garden in the south-facing plot near the cabin, working the dry soil with a hose she'd found in the collapsed shed and amending it with creek silt she hauled in a bucket. Nothing grew fast, some things didn't grow at all. But by the 6th week she had green onion shoots and the beginning of a squash vine, which seemed close to miraculous given the conditions. She baked bread when they had flour for it, using the hearth once she'd figured out its moods and rhythms. The bread was not the same as what she'd made in the bakery. The heat was inconsistent, the flour was coarser, but it was bread, and the smell of it in the cabin changed something about the place in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Made it feel inhabited rather than occupied, Caleb noticed. He didn't say much about it, but one evening he came in from a full day of fence work, sat down at the table, and tore off a piece of the loaf she'd left cooling there, and ate it standing up with the expression of someone who hadn't realized they were hungry until the smell reached them. He didn't comment. But the next morning, before he went out, he said, "Good bread," in the same tone he used to say things like "Wells holding" or "South fence is done," plain and specific, meaning what it said. She accepted it the same way. The relationship between them was, for those early weeks, something she didn't have good language for. They were technically married, practically partners, and genuinely strangers who were becoming something slower and more complicated than either of those categories. She noticed things about him the way you notice things about someone you're watching without quite meaning to. That he did the worst jobs first and the best jobs last. That he never complained about physical pain, but got very quiet when something was bothering him. That he had a habit of standing outside in the early morning and looking south at the mountains for a few minutes before starting work, like he needed to take stock of something before the day began. She didn't know what he noticed about her. She didn't ask. What she did know was that she startled less than she had in the first week. She no longer braced herself when he moved unexpectedly in her peripheral vision. She didn't plan routes of exit from rooms the way she had been doing her entire adult life. The body had its own timeline for unlearning fear, she found. It was slower than the mind, more stubborn, but it was moving. 6 weeks in, he came back from a supply run to Millard Springs, with his jaw set in a way she'd learned meant something had happened. She was at the garden when he rode in, and she watched him dismount and unsaddle the chestnut with the focused economy of motion he used when he was thinking hard. She gave him a few minutes. Then she went to the fence and leaned on it. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her. "There's talk in Millard Springs. A man's been asking about you." He kept his voice level. "Older man, big, heavy drinker. Arrived about 3 days ago, according to the storekeeper. He's been telling people you were taken against your will." She felt the cold move through her despite the afternoon heat. "Telling them Caleb Ryder kidnapped you," he continued. "He's got a description of the horses, the gray mare especially. Apparently she was recognizable." He paused. "He's offering money for information." She said nothing for a moment. "How much money?" she asked. "Enough that the wrong person might talk." She pressed both hands flat against the fence rail. The wood was rough under her palms, solid, real. She focused on that. "Did anyone take it?" she asked. "Not that I could tell, but that doesn't mean they won't." He was watching her. "He'll find his way here eventually. It's only a matter of when." She knew that. She had known it from the moment she'd ridden out of Red Hollow. Harold didn't let things go. That was one of the central facts of his personality. The one that had made those 2 previous escape attempts feel like a sentence rather than a failure. He would come. She'd never had any illusion that he wouldn't. What was different now was that she had somewhere to stand when he did. "Then we'll be ready," she said. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You sure?" "No." She pushed off the fence rail. "I'm going to start on supper." She walked back to the cabin. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. Inside, she started the fire for the evening meal, moving through the familiar routine. Kindling, then the larger wood, the particular angle that got the hearth going without smoking too much. Her grandfather had built this fireplace. Her name had been in his will. Whatever Harold was telling people in Millard Springs about taken women and drifter criminals, the deed in the territorial office had her name on it, and Caleb Ryder was her husband, and this valley was hers. She put the pot on and went to the window and looked out at the mountains turning red in the evening light, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not peace exactly, not yet, but something in the same family, a kind of intention, a determination that didn't feel like desperation. She was not the girl behind the bakery counter anymore. That girl had been worn down to almost nothing by years of flinching and shrinking and making herself small enough to survive. This place was making her into someone else, someone she didn't fully know yet. But she was beginning to want to find out. Harold Mercer came on a Thursday, which Evelyn would remember not because Thursdays meant anything in particular, but because she had just pulled a perfect loaf from the hearth, the best one yet, golden and even, finally. And she was standing at the cabin window with it in her hands when she saw the dust rising on the north trail. She knew before she could make out the rider. Something in the way the dust moved, unhurried and deliberate, like someone who wasn't worried about being seen. Harold had never been a man who approached anything quietly. He announced himself with his presence the way storms announce themselves. Something in the air shifted before you could explain why. She set the bread down on the table. "Caleb," she said. I was outside mending the corral gate, close enough to hear her if she raised her voice, which she did. Just his name. He appeared around the corner of the cabin within seconds, and she pointed north without speaking. He looked at the dust trail, then back at her. "Go inside," he said. "No." He looked at her again. Something crossed his face. Not argument exactly, more like recalculation. He nodded once and stayed where he was. They watched Harold ride in together. He looked worse than she remembered, which she hadn't thought was possible. 2 months on the trail had done something to him that she couldn't entirely name. He was thinner, maybe, or just dirtier, his hat pushed back and his coat dark with travel dust. But his eyes, when they found her across the yard, were the same. Flat and certain, the eyes of a man who had never genuinely questioned his own authority over anything. He pulled his horse up at the edge of the yard and looked around at the property with the particular expression he used when he was taking inventory of something he intended to claim. "Evelyn," he said, like she was standing in a room he'd just walked into. "Papa," she said. She was surprised by how level her voice came out. His gaze moved to Caleb. He took his time with it. "You the drifter?" "Caleb Ryder," Caleb said. He didn't move from where he was standing, about 6 feet to her left. "Her husband." Harold's jaw worked on that for a moment. "That's a funny word for kidnapping. We were married in Millard Springs, Justice of the Peace. It's registered." Registered. Harold said it like the word tasted wrong. He swung down off his horse without being invited, which was exactly the kind of thing he did. Moved through spaces as though permission was a concept that applied to other people. He dropped the reins over the fence post and walked into the yard. "I don't care what some county clerk has written down, son. That's my daughter. She's 23 years old, and she has no business making arrangements with men she doesn't know." "I'm 23, Evelyn said. "I'm not a child." He turned his full attention to her, and she felt it the way she always had, like a weight pressing down from above. The old trained instinct telling her to get smaller, to soften, to find an exit. She breathed through it. She kept her feet where they were. "You look thin," Harold said. He was doing the thing where he acted like a concerned father, the role he tried on sometimes when he wanted something. "This place is a ruin. You're living in a wreck." "It's our wreck," she said, "and it's getting better." "Evelyn." His voice dropped into the register she knew best, the one that was quiet because it didn't need to be loud. "You're coming home. I'll give you 10 minutes to get your things." The yard was silent except for the creek noise and the distant call of something in the cottonwoods. Caleb hadn't moved. He was watching Harold with an expression that was completely neutral, which Evelyn had come to understand was not the same as calm. "This is my home," she said. "My grandfather left this land to me. My name is on the deed." "Your grandfather was a fool who never understood how things work." Harold took a step toward her. "The land means nothing without someone to work it. You can't run a ranch. I'm not running it alone. You married a drifter off the street." His voice was rising now, the careful quietness dropping away the way it always did once he got going. "A man with no land, no money, no name. What kind of life is that? You walked out on your family, on everything I built? You didn't build anything, she said. I built it. I got up every morning and made that bread and ran that counter and kept that bakery alive for years, and you took the money and called it yours. Harold stopped. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen on his face before. Surprise, genuine, and unguarded, like he hadn't expected that particular sentence to exist. Like the bakery counter had always just been a fixture, like the bread had always just appeared, and he was only now realizing that someone had been putting it there every single morning for the better part of a decade. Then it passed, and his face went back to what it knew. You ungrateful girl, he said quietly. Get back on your horse, Caleb said. Harold turned his head slowly. He was a big man, and he moved like one, with the particular arrogance of someone who had rarely been physically challenged. He looked at Caleb the way he might look at something he was about to step on. Boy, he said, you don't want to get in the middle of this. I'm already in the middle of it. Caleb took a single step forward. Not aggressive, measured. I'm asking you to get back on your horse and ride back to wherever you came from. I'm asking you once, politely, because she's your daughter, and I understand that means something. He paused. But if you take another step toward her, that's done. Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. A short, humorless sound. You got this man fighting your battles now? He said to Evelyn. I'm fighting my own battle, she said. He's just standing here. Your mother said things like that too. Harold's voice had gone cold. Thought she was strong. Thought she could... Don't, Evelyn said. Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated that, hated giving him that. Don't you say a word about her. You don't get to use her. I used to carry you on my shoulders, Harold said. He seemed to shift registers without warning, which had always been one of the most disorienting things about him. The sudden turns, the apparent grief appearing from nowhere, real seeming enough that she'd spent years trying to figure out whether she was being manipulated or whether some version of the father she'd wanted was in there somewhere. You were 6 years old, and you'd sit up there and tell me what you could see. You remember that? She did remember. That was the worst part. I remember everything, she said quietly. All of it. The good years and what came after. I remember my mother. I remember both escapes. I remember what you did when you found me both times. She looked at him. I remember every single thing, Papa. That's why I'm not coming back. Harold's face went through something then. It was too complicated and too quick to fully read, grief and fury, and something else running underneath both of them, something she might have called shame on a different man. Then he moved. I was faster than she expected, or she was slower. She thought she was prepared, and she wasn't, because you were never really prepared, all those months of building a new life notwithstanding. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps with his arm already rising, and she didn't move in time. Caleb moved instead. I was between them before Harold's hand finished the arc, and he caught Harold's wrist in both hands, and he didn't stop there. He stepped through it, used Harold's own momentum, and put him on the ground. Not gently. Harold hit the dirt of the yard hard enough to raise dust, and the breath went out of him in a single harsh grunt. Caleb stood over him. He was breathing harder than usual. That was the only outward sign of what had just happened. I told you once, Caleb said. Harold lay in the dirt for a moment. He was 60 years old and had just been put down by a man half his age, and he didn't get up quickly, which was something Evelyn had never seen before in her life. Harold, on the ground, staying there. She had always thought of him as something immovable, some fixed feature of the world, and the sight of him in the dust of her yard with Caleb standing over him did something to her perception that she couldn't immediately explain. Like a familiar picture slightly tilted on a wall, suddenly revealing the shape of the nail it hung from. I was just a man. A mean, sad, diminishing man with trail dust on his coat and whiskey on his breath, lying in the dirt of land that wasn't his. Harold got to his knees slowly, then to his feet. He didn't look at Caleb. He looked at Evelyn. And what she saw on his face in that moment wasn't rage anymore. It was something more hollow than rage. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been the beginning of a different kind of anger. She couldn't tell, and she didn't trust herself to tell, because she had spent too many years trying to read his face and getting it wrong. You think this is over? He said. His voice was rough. Yes, she said. I do. I'll come back with the sheriff. I'll show him the deed was... My grandfather registered it with the territorial office 12 years ago, she said. My name has been on it since I was 11. You can show the sheriff whatever you like. I'll show him the original filing. Something moved through Harold's expression. She realized, with a kind of tired surprise, that he hadn't known about the territorial registration. He'd assumed, the way he always assumed with paperwork and institutions, that things would sort themselves out in his favor because they generally had. The territorial record was something he hadn't counted on. His jaw worked. He looked at the cabin, at the garden, small but green near the south wall, at the repaired fence line and the barn with its new timber visible against the weathered gray. He looked at all of it the way he'd looked at everything that had ever slipped out of his grip, with the specific resentment of a man who had confused possession with ownership his entire life and was only now beginning to notice the difference. He picked up his hat from the dirt. He knocked the dust off it against his thigh. You'll regret this, he said. It came out tired rather than threatening, which was somehow worse than the threat would have been. I've regretted a lot of things, Evelyn said. Leaving isn't one of them. Harold walked to his horse. He mounted without looking at either of them again and rode north, and Evelyn watched him go until the dust swallowed him and the trail was empty and the creek was the loudest thing in the valley. She stood there for a while after he was gone. Her hands were not steady, it turned out. All that stillness she'd managed during the confrontation had been borrowed time, and the debt was coming due. Her fingers were shaking and her jaw ached from clenching it, and there was a burning at the back of her eyes that she absolutely refused to let go anywhere. Caleb didn't say anything. He stood nearby, not close enough to crowd her, just present. She was beginning to understand that this was something he did deliberately. Gave her room, stayed in it with her, let the silence be what it needed to be. After a while she said, "Thank you." "You did most of it," he said. "I wasn't going to stop him in time." "No." He didn't soften it. "But everything before that was you." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand once, briskly, like attending to a practical matter. She turned and looked at the cabin. The bread was still on the table where she'd left it. "Supper's going to be late," she said. "That's all right." She went inside. She stood at the table and looked at the bread for a long moment. The loaf that had come out perfect, right before the dust had risen on the north trail. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, then set it back down and sat in the chair and put her face in her palms. She allowed herself about 3 minutes of it. The shaking, the burning in her chest, the years of accumulated pressure that Harold's visit had cracked open just by existing. She let it happen because she'd learned that not letting it happen only meant it found somewhere worse to go. Then she stopped. She breathed. She got up and started the fire for supper. When Caleb came in a little while later, she was at the hearth, and the cabin smelled like bread and wood smoke, and neither of them said anything about Harold Mercer for the rest of the evening. There would be time for that. There would be time to think through what he might do next, whether he'd actually try the sheriff, what the territorial record would do to any legal challenge he might mount. But not tonight. Tonight she put food on the table and they ate together in the firelight, and at some point Caleb looked across the table at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something open in it, something that had come loose from its usual careful restraint, and she held the look instead of glancing away, which was new for both of them. The fire threw uneven light across the walls. Outside, the creek ran on. The valley settled into its nighttime quiet, the kind that had started to feel, over these past weeks, less like emptiness and more like something she was part of. Later, much later, when the fire had gone to coals and the cabin was dark and still, she lay on the real bed. They'd stuffed a new mattress tick with dried grass 3 weeks ago, serviceable if not comfortable, and she thought about her mother, about how her mother had stayed, about the years that staying had cost her, the slow erosion of a person who had been, before Harold got his full grip on her, someone with her own shape. She thought about the look on Harold's face when she'd said, "I remember everything." She thought about Caleb standing between her and her father's raised hand without hesitation, without theater, without any apparent need to be thanked for it after. She pressed one hand flat against the mattress tick and felt the solidity of the pine bed frame beneath it, the floor beneath that, the bedrock of the valley beneath all of it. She was here. She had stayed standing. Sometime before midnight, without meaning to, she reached across the dark and found his hand. He didn't say anything. He turned his palm up and held on. She found out she was pregnant 6 weeks later, on a cold October morning when the mountains had their first snow on them and the creek ran ice-edged, and she was kneeling in the garden turning over the last of the season's soil when the world went briefly sideways and she had to sit down in the dirt until it steadied. She sat there for a while, hands in her lap, looking at the mountains. Then she got up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and went to find Caleb. She found him at the south fence, resetting a post that had shifted in the first hard frost. She stood at the edge of the field and watched him work for a moment before she said anything. The way he drove the post, steady and methodical, the particular set of his shoulders that she'd spent months learning to read like weather. Caleb, he turned. He could tell from her face that something had changed. She'd noticed early on that he was better at reading her than most people were, which had unsettled her at first and now felt like something else entirely. She told him plainly, no lead up, no softening. That was the way she'd learned to say hard things. I was quiet for longer than she expected. Long enough that she started counting the seconds without meaning to. He set the post driver down against the fence line and took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair, and she watched his face move through something complicated and unresolved. You all right? He finally said. It wasn't what she'd expected him to say. She'd been braced for something about logistics, about timing, about what they would do. The question surprised her enough that she had to think about it honestly. I don't know yet, she said. I think so. He nodded slowly. He looked out at the south pasture, the long dry grass, the mountains beyond, the wide sky. Then he looked back at her and said, We'll figure it out, which was not a romantic thing to say, and was also exactly the right thing, because it was true, and it was the same thing they'd said about the well and the barn and the 60 other problems that had come at them since August. They had figured things out. That was the one reliable fact of their life together so far. I know, she said. He picked up the post driver. She went back to the cabin. That was how they handled most things. Directly, without much ceremony. And then you went back to what needed doing, because what needed doing didn't stop. The winter came down hard that year. The kind of Nevada cold that drove straight through the cabin walls and made the water in the basin freeze before morning. Evelyn expanded the kitchen garden plans on paper through the cold months, sitting close to the hearth with her grandfather's old survey map spread on the table, working out which plots would get the most spring sun. Caleb spent the winter repairing tools, reinforcing the cabin's insulation with clay and straw, and making 2 trips to Millard Springs through weather bad enough that both times she didn't exhale properly until she heard the chestnut's hooves coming up the north trail. She never told him that. She didn't think she needed to. By the time the first thaw came in March, she was visibly pregnant and had developed a new relationship with the ground. Specifically, a deep and personal resentment of anything that required bending toward it. She worked anyway, because the work didn't reorganize itself around her body's opinions. But she was slower, and things that had been easy in October were complicated now. And some mornings she sat at the table for an extra 15 minutes before starting the day, and didn't apologize to anyone about it. Caleb picked up what she couldn't reach without comment and without making her feel managed, which she appreciated more than she had words for. He wasn't sentimental about it. He didn't treat her like something fragile, which she would have hated. He just quietly redistributed. The heavy water hauling became his job. The fence work she'd been doing on the east side of the property, he folded into his own rounds. He never said anything about it directly, and she never thanked him directly, which was its own kind of language between them by then. Spring arrived with its usual combination of promise and inconvenience. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The south garden plots came alive faster than she'd hoped. Not everything. Some of the seedlings she'd started indoors didn't survive the transplant, and she lost the entire first row of beans to something that had overwintered in the soil. But enough. The kitchen garden took hold in a real way that spring, and she expanded it, pushing the fence line another 10 feet south, and working the new soil in the evenings while the light lasted. Word had come through Millard Springs in February, passed along by the storekeeper's wife who'd heard it from a freighter who'd come down from the north. Harold Mercer had lost the bakery. He'd lost it the way men like Harold always lost things. Not all at once, but through a series of decisions that each seemed survivable until the accumulated weight of them became too much. He'd borrowed against the property to cover debts she hadn't known existed. He'd stopped managing the business and let it drift. The building had gone to the bank sometime around November. Last anyone had heard, Harold was living above the saloon in Red Hollow, working occasional odd jobs and drinking the remainder of whatever money he'd managed to keep. Evelyn had stood in the kitchen of the cabin for a long time after the storekeeper's wife told her, turning a dish towel over in her hands without wringing it. She'd expected to feel something sharp and satisfying about it. Instead, it sat in her chest like a dull weight. Not grief, exactly, but something in the same neighborhood. The bakery had been her prison for years. It had also been her mother's kitchen and her grandfather's supplier, and the place where she'd learned every bread recipe she knew. The building itself hadn't done anything wrong. "You okay?" Caleb had asked later that evening. "I was thinking about the bakery," she said. "The actual building, the oven." He waited. "I could fix that oven," she said. "I mean, I knew exactly what was wrong with it. I could have fixed it in a day if anyone had let me." "I know," he said quietly. She folded the dish towel and set it on the table. "It's just a building," she said. "It doesn't matter." "It matters some," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady attention that had stopped unsettling her somewhere around the third month, and had become instead something she oriented toward, the way you oriented toward the warmest part of a room. "Some," she agreed. Their son was born in June, which was the best month for it. Warm enough that the nights weren't dangerous. Long enough days that Caleb could get his work done and still be back at the cabin by the time things got difficult in the evenings. They'd arranged for a woman from Millard Springs, a Mrs. Tennyson who'd midwifed half the county over 20 years, to come out 2 weeks before the due date and stay through the birth. Mrs. Tennyson was efficient and unsentimental and told Evelyn exactly what to expect with a frankness that Evelyn found deeply reassuring after months of people being vague and careful about it. The labor was long and not gentle, which Mrs. Tennyson had also warned her about. Caleb stayed outside the cabin because Mrs. Tennyson put him there firmly, and he went without argument, and Evelyn labored through most of a hot June day with the windows open and the creak audible between contractions, something to anchor to. When it was over, Mrs. Tennyson put the baby in her arms, and Evelyn looked down at him. This red-faced, furious, squalling person who had apparently been very inconvenienced by the whole process, and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a comparison for. Not the gentle warmth of stories, something more like structural, like a load-bearing wall had been added. Caleb came in when Mrs. Tennyson called him. He stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that was completely stripped of his usual composure, open and uncertain, and something that looked almost like fear, the kind that comes from suddenly having more to lose. "He's so small," Caleb said. "He's apparently normal-sized," Evelyn said. Mrs. Tennyson was clear about that. "He looks angry. He comes by it honestly." Caleb looked at her then, and she was too tired to manage her face into anything careful, so he got the full version of whatever was on it. He sat on the edge of the bed carefully, and she let him hold the baby and watched him figure out how to do it, the adjustment of his arms, the instinctive change in how he held his shoulders, and thought that this was one of the stranger and more real things she had ever seen. They named him Thomas, after her grandfather. Thomas Ryder grew up in a household that was imperfect in the specific ways that households built from almost nothing tend to be. Uneven floors and patched walls, and the particular smell of wood smoke that got into everything. He grew up knowing that the creek flooded in spring and the east fence needed checking every fall, and that his mother's bread was better than anything you could buy in Millard Springs, which he stated as established fact to other children from the age of 4. He grew up watching his father work and work and work, and he grew up watching his mother do the same thing in different rooms with different tools, and he absorbed the way children absorb things without being formally taught. The basic understanding that what you built was yours, and what was yours was worth protecting. The bakery operation. Evelyn started 3 years after Thomas was born, was not grand in its beginnings. She converted the smaller outbuilding, the one that had been a grain storage shed, and before that, according to her grandfather's notes, a smokehouse, into a working kitchen. She installed a proper baker's oven with help from a mason in Millard Springs, traded 3 months of bread supply to cover the cost of the brickwork. The first customers were neighboring ranch families, then families from Millard Springs proper. Then, as word moved the way it does in sparse country, slowly but thoroughly, people from further out. By the end of the second year, she was selling more bread in a week than the Red Hollow Bakery had managed in a month, which she did not say to anyone but noted privately with a feeling she chose not to examine too closely. Caleb's cattle operation expanded more slowly, the way cattle operations did. Land, then stock, then the long, patient arithmetic of breeding and grazing and market timing. He was good at it. Not flashy, not the kind of rancher who made bold moves and big announcements, but careful and consistent, and the cattle responded to that the same way the fence lines and the barn had responded to it. They held. He hired his first hand in the 4th year, a young man from Millard Springs named Pete, who was 17 and needed work and turned out to be both reliable and capable of learning, which Caleb said was about all you could ask for when you hired someone. How do you know he won't leave the minute someone offers him more? Evelyn asked. I don't, Caleb said. That's the part you can't control. You just treat people decent and hope the decent ones notice. She thought about that. That's your whole theory of hiring? Pretty much. That's a terrible theory. It's worked so far. Pete stayed 4 years and left to start his own operation, which Caleb said proved his theory and Evelyn said proved nothing of the kind. They hired 2 men after Pete, and both of them stayed. Black Creek Ranch developed the kind of reputation that spread without advertising, as a place that paid on time and didn't work men past what was fair and meant what it said, which in the Nevada territory was not as common as it should have been. The second child, a daughter, Ruth, arrived when Thomas was 5, in a much shorter labor that Mrs. Tennyson, who came back for it, seemed almost offended by on principle. Ruth came out with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady eyes, and an expression of general assessment that she maintained consistently throughout childhood, looking at the world the way you looked at a fence line you were deciding whether or not to trust. Evelyn watched her daughter grow and felt things she didn't always have language for. A fierce protective anger at the idea of what Ruth's life might have looked like in different circumstances, in a different house, with different parents. She thought sometimes about her own mother, about the shape of what had been lost there, and she made decisions in her own house that were the opposite of her childhood in ways both large and small. She raised her voice sometimes. She was not patient every day or gracious every evening. She burned bread and lost her temper over fence line arguments, and cried twice in the 4th year when things got hard enough that crying seemed like the only practical response. But she did not make fear a language in her house. She did not let her bad days become her children's problem in the ways that mattered. And she noticed, over the years, that Thomas and Ruth both had the qualities she'd tried hardest to protect in them. They were not afraid of her. They argued with her. They pushed back. Ruth in particular had strong opinions about almost everything and delivered them without apology, which drove Evelyn to occasional distraction and filled her with a pride so intense it was almost uncomfortable. The news about Harold came in the 7th year. A letter, forwarded through the Millard Springs post office from a county official in Red Hollow, brief, administrative, informing her that Harold Mercer had been sentenced to 18 months in the county jail following a violent altercation at a saloon. The letter asked if she wished to be notified of his release. She sat with the letter for 2 days before she told Caleb about it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I don't know yet." He didn't push. He never pushed, which was one of the things about him that had stopped annoying her and become something she considered essential. She went on with the week. She made bread and managed the books and argued with Ruth about the proper way to set a bread loaf to rise, and she thought about her father in a jail cell and tried to locate inside herself the straightforward satisfaction she'd always imagined she would feel at this particular development. It wasn't there. What was there instead was something more complicated, the residue of a childhood that had contained good things before it had contained bad ones. The image of a man carrying a 6-year-old on his shoulders, asking her what she could see, layered underneath and inseparable from everything that had come after. She was not capable of pure feelings about Harold Mercer. She had tried for years and had finally accepted that the accounting of him would never come out clean. What she knew was this: her children would not have that accounting to do. Whatever Harold had planted in her by way of fear and anger and the particular damage of loving someone who hurt you, it stopped here. She had held it, and she would keep holding it, and it would not pass forward. That was the choice she had made when she walked out of the bakery with a deed in her pocket. She had been making it every day since. One Tuesday evening in October, with the mountains going amber outside the window, and Thomas doing something noisy with the dog in the yard, and Ruth sitting at the table with total concentration on a piece of embroidery. She was just failing at magnificently. Evelyn set a fresh loaf on the table and stood back and looked at her house. It was not a beautiful house. The floor was still slightly uneven in the northwest corner. The window in the front room had a crack she kept meaning to have reglazed. The table had a burn mark on one end from an incident with the lamp 2 summers ago that nobody had ever fully explained. Caleb came in from outside and stamped the mud off his boots at the door and looked at the bread, and then at her, and she held the look the same way she'd learned to hold it, not flinching, not managing it, just there. "Good day?" he asked. "Decent," she said. "You?" "Southherd's looking strong. Should have a good spring count." Pete's replacement working out? Better than Pete, honestly. Don't tell Pete. She almost smiled. Ruth looked up from the embroidery long enough to roll her eyes at both of them, which Thomas, coming in through the back with mud on his boots and the dog at his heels, missed entirely. Boots? Evelyn said. I know. You know, and you're still tracking mud. The dog did most of it. The dog doesn't wear boots. Caleb caught her eye over the children's heads. There was something in his face in that moment, quiet and settled, the expression of a man who had come a long way from wherever he'd started and had landed somewhere that felt, on balance, like the right place. She knew that look. She'd been watching it for 7 years. She turned back to the bread and cut the first slice, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, and outside the Nevada mountains went on turning gold in the late light, indifferent and ancient and absolutely unchanged by any of it. Which was fine. Some things didn't need to know they mattered. The letter from the county jail arrived on a Wednesday, 9 months after the first one. It was not from the county official this time. The handwriting on the envelope was unsteady, the letters formed with the careful effort of someone whose hands weren't reliable anymore. And Evelyn recognized it anyway, because you didn't forget the handwriting of the person who'd run your life for 23 years. She stood at the kitchen table and held the envelope for a long moment without opening it, long enough that Ruth came in from outside and looked at her mother's face and quietly went back out again without saying anything, which was one of the things about Ruth. She had good instincts about when to give a room back. Caleb was out with the herd. Thomas was in Millard Springs on a supply run, old enough now at 12 to make the ride alone, which still required Evelyn to actively resist checking the North Trail every 20 minutes until he came back. She was alone in the kitchen with the letter and the smell of that morning's bread and the creak sound coming through the open window. She opened it. Harold's handwriting covered one page, front and back. He had not written to ask for anything, which was the first thing she checked for. He had not made excuses, which was the second. What he had written instead was something she hadn't expected and wouldn't have predicted, and she read it twice and then sat down in the kitchen chair and read it a third time. He wrote about her mother, about the early years of their marriage, before the drinking had become the dominant fact of his character, when he had been, his word, and she turned it over carefully, different. He wrote about the bakery, not the building, but the work itself, and how he had watched Evelyn manage it through her teenage years with a competence he had recognized and never said out loud. He wrote that he had been in a jail cell for 9 months with very little to do besides think, and that thinking, it turned out, was not something he had done enough of when there had been other options available. He did not ask for forgiveness. She noted that specifically. He wrote, near the end of the page, I am not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned the right to ask that. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that I understand now what I was. I didn't understand it before. I thought I had reasons. Everyone thinks they have reasons. The last line said, your grandfather was right to leave that land to you. I should have told you that a long time ago. She folded the letter and put it on the table and looked at it. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the hearth had gone to coals. She got up and added wood to it because the bread for tomorrow needed the hearth properly seasoned, and she stood there with the poker in her hand and thought about her father in a jail cell writing a letter with shaking hands, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about the 6-year-old girl on a man's shoulders asking what she could see. She thought, this is not enough. And it's also something. Both of those things were true at the same time. She had learned, over the years, that the most honest positions were usually the ones that held two true things simultaneously without forcing them to resolve. She wrote back 3 days later. It took her 3 drafts to find the version that was honest without being cruel and direct without being cold. She was not a woman who trafficked in false warmth. Harold knew her well enough to recognize performance, and she owed him honesty if she owed him anything. She wrote that she had received his letter and read it. She wrote that she believed him, which she did, with the qualified belief you gave to late realizations, real, but arriving after most of the damage had been done. She wrote that her children were well, and that the ranch was prospering, and that the bakery operation she'd built in the old smokehouse had become something neither of them could have imagined from the red hollow counter. She did not write that she forgave him. She wrote instead, what I can tell you is that I don't carry it the way I used to. I used to carry it like something I had to hold on to, or I'd forget what I was protecting myself from. I don't need to protect myself from you anymore, Papa. I'm not sure that's the same thing as forgiveness, but it's what I have. She sealed the envelope and gave it to Thomas to post when he next went to Millard Springs, and she didn't tell him who it was for, and he didn't ask, because Thomas at 12 had already developed the discretion of a much older person, which she attributed partly to Caleb and partly to the fact that he'd grown up in a house where adults treated their own business as their own business. Harold was released from jail the following spring. He did not come to Black Creek Valley. He sent a single postcard from a town 200 miles north with no return address. That said only, "Glad to hear the ranch is doing well. That's how it should be." She put the postcard in the tin box where she kept the deed to the property and her mother's silver brooch, and she didn't look at it again for years. But she kept it. That was a decision, too. The decade that followed was not a triumphant march. It was a decade, which meant it contained everything that decades contain. Good years and lean ones, a drought in the third year that killed 2 of Caleb's best breeding bulls and set the cattle operation back 18 months. A winter that collapsed the bakery kitchen roof under 3 feet of wet snow and required a full rebuild in February, which was the worst possible month to do it. Thomas broke his left arm falling from the north fence at 14 and healed crooked enough that it gave him trouble in cold weather for the rest of his life. Ruth failed to take to cattle work with any enthusiasm whatsoever, which caused a period of tension with Caleb that resolved itself when Ruth announced at 16 that she intended to expand the bakery business and wanted to discuss the financial arrangements, at which point Caleb looked at Evelyn with an expression that said he recognized exactly whose daughter this was. "She gets the negotiating from you," he said later. "She gets the stubbornness from you," Evelyn said. "I'm not stubborn." "Caleb, I'm consistent. You're stubborn and consistent." She got both. Ruth opened a second bakery operation in Millard Springs at 18, which was young and probably ill-advised and succeeded anyway, through a combination of her mother's bread recipes, her father's work ethic, and her own considerable talent for making people feel like buying things, was their idea. By 20, she had a reputation in the county that preceded her name. By 22, she had a business partner, a young woman named Clara from the eastern settlements who had capital and organizational ability that complemented Ruth's instincts. And the two of them together were something that Evelyn watched with a complicated mix of pride and the slight vertigo of seeing your own qualities operating in someone else, amplified and pointed in directions you hadn't anticipated. Thomas became the rancher. He had the patience for it, the same long-horizon thinking his father had, and he expanded Black Creek's cattle holdings methodically in his early 20s, adding land to the south when it came available, building the herd with the same quiet arithmetic Caleb had taught him. He was not his father's copy. Thomas had his mother's directness and a temper that ran hotter than either of his parents before cooling into something reasonable, and he made decisions faster than Caleb ever had, sometimes correctly and sometimes expensively, and he learned from both kinds. He married at 24, a rancher's daughter from the valley south of them named Margaret, who had strong opinions about horses and a laugh you could hear from the other side of the property, and who met Evelyn for the first time at the kitchen table over bread and coffee, and looked at her with direct assessment and said, "Thomas says you built this whole operation from nothing." "We built it," Evelyn said. "He said you had $15 and a deed, and 37 combined, and a gray mare that was 16 years old." Margaret looked at the kitchen, at the rebuilt hearth and the proper glass in the windows and the shelves of canning jars and the bread cooling on the rack. "How long did it take to feel real?" she asked. "Like, actually real, not just something you were holding together." Evelyn thought about it honestly. 5 years before I stopped waiting for it to fall apart," she said. "Maybe 7 before I stopped being surprised that it hadn't." Margaret nodded like that was useful information. Evelyn decided she liked her. Caleb turned 53 in the 11th year on Black Creek, and Evelyn threw him a birthday dinner that got somewhat out of hand when Thomas invited the 2 ranch hands and their families, and Ruth came up from Millard Springs with Clara and 3 pies. And the small cabin that had once been a cold and dusty ruin was so full of people that they ended up eating on the porch in the late summer evening, which turned out to be better anyway. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway at some point during the evening and looked at all of it. The people she knew crowded onto the porch, the sound of voices and plates, and the particular noise of children being children, the mountains going purple in the distance, the creek running somewhere below all of it. And she felt the weight of time in a way she rarely let herself. She had been 23 when she rode out of Red Hollow on a 16-year-old mare with a deed in her pocket and no certainty about anything. She was 34 now, which was not old, but which was far enough from 23 to be able to look back at it clearly. The girl she'd been then, the one who had pressed her forehead against the bakery window and allowed herself 10 seconds of wanting a different life. That girl had deserved better than she'd been given, and had taken what was offered when something better finally appeared, and had done the work of building the life with her own hands, imperfectly and stubbornly, and without any guarantee of outcome. There was nothing clean or inevitable about how it had gone. She had been lucky in specific, identifiable ways. A stranger who turned out to be decent, a grandfather who had put her name on a deed, a piece of land with water on it. Take any one of those away and the story went differently. She had been unlucky in other ways that didn't need enumerating. She didn't believe that hard work always produced outcomes, or that good people were protected from bad ones. She had watched enough of the territory's history to know that wasn't how it worked. What she believed was narrower and more practical, that you made the best decisions you could from the position you were actually in, that you held on to what was worth holding on to, and that the kind of damage you'd received could be stopped at you if you were willing to do the work of stopping it, which was not a romantic idea, and was not always possible, but was more possible than most frightened people believed. She believed that because she had done it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but done it. Caleb appeared at her shoulder with 2 cups of coffee. He'd been doing that for 11 years, appearing with coffee at the precise moment she needed something to hold. She wasn't sure he was conscious of it. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm allowed." "I didn't say you weren't." He handed her the cup. "What about?" She looked at the porch. Thomas was showing Ruth's business partner Clara something about the south fence line, pointing at it with the authority of someone who had repaired it personally. Ruth was sitting with Margaret, talking with her hands the way she always did when she was excited about something. The ranch hand's children were doing something that involved the dog and a rope and escalating noise. "About how it started," she said. I was quiet beside her. She felt him consider several responses and discard them, which she recognized by now as a specific quality of his silence. Not empty, but working. "The bread pan," he finally said. She looked at him. "What?" "First thing I noticed about you when I was watching from the land office window." He looked out at the porch. "Before the flour delivery. Before any of it. You came to the front window of the bakery with a bread pan and you stood there for a second looking at something I couldn't see, and there was something in how you stood that—" He stopped. "I don't know. You looked like someone who was very far away from where they wanted to be." She hadn't known that. After 11 years, she hadn't known that particular detail. "And you decided to do something about it?" she said. "I decided to not look away," he said. "Which isn't the same thing." She thought about the difference between deciding to act and deciding not to ignore. How one was a grand gesture and the other was quieter and maybe more sustainable. The kind of choice you could keep making every day without burning out from the heroism of it. "I'm glad you didn't," she said. "Me too." The evening went on. The coffee cooled in her hands. Ruth's voice rose above the general noise making a point about something, and Thomas laughed at it from across the porch. And the dog finally escaped the children and came inside and went straight to the hearth with the dignity of someone who had earned it. When most people had gone and the children had been collected and Ruth and Clara had ridden back toward Millard Springs in the last of the light, Evelyn and Caleb sat on the porch steps the way they'd started doing in the second year, side by side with the valley spread out in front of them. The creek invisible in the dark, but audible, always audible. "Harold sent another postcard," she said. "Last month. I forgot to mention it." "How is he?" "He didn't say much. He's in a town in northern Nevada. He said winter there was hard." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I think he's sick." Reading between the lines. Caleb said nothing for a moment. "Are you going to do anything about that?" It was the right question, and the honest answer was that she didn't know, and she said so. She had thought about writing back. She had thought about sending money, which she could afford now, which was still a strange fact to hold. She had thought about going north herself, which she thought about less and discarded each time. Not from cruelty, but from a clear-eyed understanding that there were things the body couldn't do that the mind thought it should. What she finally said was, "I'll write to him. I'll tell him if he needs anything, he can ask. And if he asks, then I'll decide from there." She looked at the mountains, black against the dark blue of the late sky. "I can't fix what he is. I couldn't fix it when I was living in the middle of it, and I can't fix it from here. But I can write to him. He's my father. He's the only one I'll ever have, for whatever that's worth." She felt Caleb nod beside her. Not agreement exactly. Acknowledgement. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said. That bread pan you saw me with, through the window. What about it? I burned it, later that morning, always burned the Tuesday bread a little. She almost smiled at the thought of it. I rotated the pans every 12 minutes, and it still burned a little. I never figured out how to fully fix it. Some things you just work around, he said. Yeah. She leaned her shoulder against his lightly. Yeah, I suppose you do. They sat on the steps as the last color left the sky, and the stars came out over the Nevada mountains. Not all at once, but gradually, one appearing and then suddenly too many to count, which was how most good things arrived, she'd found. Not in dramatic moments, but in accumulation. One unremarkable day building on another, until you looked up and realized you were somewhere completely different from where you'd started. The property was quiet now. The creek ran on. Somewhere in the south pasture the cattle were doing whatever cattle did in the dark, and the barn that Caleb had rebuilt from rotted timber stood solid against the sky, and the kitchen garden that she'd hauled creek silt to build had grown over the years into something that fed them through winter without drama, and the bakery and the old smokehouse had made her something she would never have predicted, a woman with a reputation, whose bread people drove 12 miles for, whose name meant something in the county. She was not a finished person. She still had the flinch sometimes, deep in her body, when something moved fast in her peripheral vision. She still had days when the accumulated weight of the early years pressed down, and she had to sit at the kitchen table an extra 15 minutes before she could function like herself. She had a temper she hadn't entirely domesticated, and a stubbornness that served her half the time and frustrated everyone around her the other half. But she had made a life. Not despite everything. That framing had always bothered her, the idea that hardship was redeemed by outcome, that the suffering was worth it because of what came after. She rejected that accounting. The suffering had not been worth it. It had just been what happened, and she had survived it, and she had built something on the other side of it, and those were three separate facts that didn't need to be braided into a lesson. The lesson, if she was honest, was simpler and less dramatic than any story wanted it to be. You find the solid ground under your feet, and you stand on it. You hold the match carefully until there's something dry to strike it against. And when a stranger looks at your bruises and doesn't look away, you pay attention, because that kind of person is rarer than the world should allow. She had paid attention. The mountains stayed where they were, unmoved and incurious, as they would remain long after every name on the Black Creek deed had passed into the kind of history that counties record in yellowed ledgers and mostly forget. But the creek kept running. The cottonwoods would seed themselves next spring and the spring after. And somewhere in the dark of the south pasture, the cattle Caleb had built the herd from stood in the Nevada night, solid and present, as real as anything in the world. She pressed her shoulder against her husband.